It all started with something that seemed so small. A fine. A simple piece of paper tucked into a mailbox, carrying with it a warning that was supposed to scare a family into submission. But what no one expected was how that single sheet of paper would ignite a chain of events that would shake an entire neighborhood. A wife standing her ground against the unfair rules of an HOA. A husband caught in the middle, trying to keep the peace. And then, a knock on the door. Police officers called in over something so petty, so absurd, that the neighbors watched in disbelief. But when the officers' eyes locked on the homeowner, the neighborhood's petty drama twisted into something no one could have predicted. Because at that moment, everyone realized the person standing on the porch wasn't just another resident. They were someone the officer never expected to see. How does a simple HOA fine spiral into a showdown that leaves an entire street speechless? And what happens when the one thing the HOA relies on, fear, suddenly shatters? Let's start from the beginning. The neighborhood had always looked picture-perfect from the outside. Lush green lawns, identical houses lined up like soldiers, flower beds neatly trimmed, and cars parked exactly where they should be. To anyone passing through, it looked like the kind of place where nothing ever went wrong, the kind of place people worked their entire lives to live in. For the family at the center of this story, moving here had been a dream fulfilled. They had worked hard, saved carefully, and finally they had the keys to their own little slice of suburban peace. Their mornings were simple: coffee on the porch, watching the sun peek over rooftops. Their evenings were filled with the laughter of children playing in the yard, the sound of sprinklers ticking in rhythm, and the comfort of knowing they had built a home where memories would last. But behind the perfect lawns and tidy streets, something darker lingered. And though they couldn't see it yet, the family was about to learn just how quickly peace can unravel when control becomes an obsession. The HOA had always been there, of course, like an invisible hand guiding every decision. At first it seemed harmless. Reminders about trash cans, friendly notes about keeping mailboxes painted. But slowly the tone shifted. The letters grew sharper. The demands became stranger. And soon, what had once felt like a friendly agreement to keep the neighborhood nice turned into something suffocating. The first fine didn't shock them too much. After all, everyone received one eventually. This one was for a flower pot, apparently placed 2 inches too far from the porch railing. The family laughed it off, thinking it was a mistake, a silly oversight. They adjusted the pot and paid the small fine just to keep the peace. But then came another, and another, each one for something more absurd than the last. A child's bike was left leaning against the garage for 10 minutes. Curtains that weren't neutral enough from the outside. Grass that, according to the HOA inspector, had grown half an inch too long between mowings. The peace they had once cherished was slowly slipping away. Every time the mailbox creaked open, anxiety crept in. Every time they saw someone walking the street with a clipboard, their stomachs tightened. The house that was supposed to be their sanctuary was starting to feel like a prison. Neighbors whispered about the same frustrations, but few dared to speak out. Everyone knew what happened if you pushed back. The fines would multiply, the threats would escalate, and soon the HOA could take what you had worked your whole life for. Fear kept them compliant, silent, trapped in their own homes. But this family, they weren't willing to surrender so easily. They could feel the tension building, like a storm rolling in, and deep down, they knew it was only a matter of time before something snapped. The breaking point came with a fine that was so outrageous, so unbelievable, it left them staring at the paper in stunned silence. The HOA claimed their driveway had imperfections in the concrete. Not cracks, not damage, but imperfections. Vague, undefined, impossible to measure. And the cost to correct this so-called violation? Thousands of dollars. This wasn't about maintaining the neighborhood anymore. This was about control, about power. When the family refused to pay, the letters turned into threats. Threats turned into warnings of liens. And soon the HOA made their boldest move yet. They called in the police. It was absurd, almost laughable. To think that law enforcement could be summoned over something as trivial as an HOA fine. But the family weren't laughing when flashing lights lit up their street one evening, and neighbors peeked through blinds to watch the drama unfold. The officer stepped out, calm but stern. The HOA board members stood a few paces back, smug, arms crossed as if they had already won. To them, this was the moment they proved no one could defy them. The officer knocked. The wife answered, her heart pounding but her face steady. The conversation began predictably. Accusations, demands, and citations were waved like weapons. But then came the twist. The officer paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing, recognition flickering across his face. He knew her, not as just another homeowner, not as just another resident of a suburban street. He knew her from somewhere else, somewhere far more important. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted so suddenly, so completely, the smug expressions of the HOA board members faltered, because the officer's next words changed everything. The silence after his recognition was deafening. The HOA members, once so confident, suddenly looked uneasy, as if the ground beneath them had cracked open. The wife stood taller now, her voice steady as she explained their side of the story. And for the first time, someone in uniform, someone with actual authority, listened. The officer turned, slowly, deliberately, to face the HOA board. His expression hardened. His voice, calm but commanding, carried a weight the board members had never faced before. He reminded them of the limits of their power and the boundaries of the law they had conveniently ignored. He made it clear, harassment disguised as enforcement would not be tolerated. The board stammered, their voices suddenly small, their confidence stripped away in front of the very neighbors they had once intimidated. Whispers spread through the crowd that had gathered. Neighbors who had come out under the glow of streetlights, watching history unfold. And then, the words that sealed the moment, "This ends now." For the family, it was vindication. For the neighborhood, it was liberation. And for the HOA board, it was the beginning of their downfall. But while the confrontation ended that night, the true resolution was only just beginning. The day after the confrontation, the entire community felt different. For months, there had been a cloud hanging over the neighborhood. The unspoken tension, the fear of receiving another petty violation notice, and the exhaustion of watching one's home and peace constantly monitored. But now, that cloud was lifting. News of what had unfolded spread faster than anyone could contain. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact at HOA meetings suddenly found themselves whispering in groups on sidewalks, recounting the moment the officer had stepped in and shifted the balance of power. People who had been silent, even complicit, were finally emboldened to speak up. It was as if one act of standing firm had broken the spell of control. Other residents began stepping forward with their own stories. One had been told to repaint their shutters a slightly different shade of blue. Another had been fined for parking their truck too close to their own garage. Someone else confessed they had been threatened for leaving a holiday wreath on their door too long past the season. Each story revealed the same pattern: fear, silence, and then submission. But now that pattern was cracking. A group of homeowners quietly organized a petition. They wanted accountability. They wanted transparency. And most importantly, they wanted balance. No one was against rules that made sense, keeping yards tidy, ensuring the streets stayed safe. But everyone was tired of rules being weaponized, of leadership turning into dictatorship. The petition grew faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, the same HOA board that had once strutted with power now faced its own reckoning. The head of the HOA, once untouchable, was suddenly the subject of scrutiny. Meetings that had once been staged and one-sided turned into heated sessions where residents demanded answers. The air of intimidation was gone. In its place was defiance, unity, and the kind of courage that only comes when people realize they're not alone. For the family at the center of it all, the impact was deeply personal. What had started as an exhausting battle had become something much larger, a community reclaiming its voice. They had never asked to be the catalyst, but in standing up they had lit a spark. And sometimes, a spark is all it takes to burn down years of unchecked control. Months later, the HOA leadership changed hands. The faces that had once peered from behind clipboards and rule books were gone, replaced by neighbors who actually cared about harmony rather than control. Rules still existed, of course, but they made sense now. They served the community rather than oppressing it. The petty power games had lost their grip, replaced by something healthier: respect. Looking back, the homeowner realized how close they had come to giving in, how tempting it had been to just pay the fine, to comply with demands that made no sense, just to buy a little peace. But peace bought that way is never real. It's just borrowed, and sooner or later the cost becomes unbearable. By refusing to surrender, they hadn't just saved themselves, they'd saved everyone. The officer who had intervened that night would never know just how much his presence had changed things. In a single moment, when the tension was at its breaking point, he had reminded everyone what real authority looks like. Not the kind that hides behind paperwork or wields fines like weapons, but the kind that restores balance and protects fairness. Even long after the dust settled, people in the neighborhood still talked about it. New families who moved in heard the story passed around like a local legend. "This is the street," they'd say, "where the HOA finally got put in its place." And every time the story was retold, it carried the same unshakable message: power only lasts as long as people are too afraid to challenge it. The family's yard still bloomed with flowers. The swing on the porch still creaked in the evening breeze, and though the community wasn't perfect, no neighborhood ever is, it was finally free from the shadow of fear. There was laughter in the streets again, children riding bikes without parents glancing nervously over their shoulders, and neighbors waving without hesitation. In the end, the true victory wasn't just about winning against the HOA. It was about reclaiming dignity. It was about showing that no rule, no board, no self-appointed enforcer could strip away the basic right to live peacefully in one's own home. And maybe that's the part worth remembering most. Because whether it's an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or any other force that tries to control through fear, the truth remains the same. Peace isn't given. It's earned, protected, and sometimes fought for. So the next time you hear of someone facing the heavy hand of a petty rulemaker, think of this family. Think of the moment when silence turned to defiance, when fear gave way to unity, and when one act of courage sparked a change that spread far beyond a single house. Because sometimes, the most ordinary people end up teaching the most extraordinary lesson. You don't have to surrender your peace. You don't have to bow to unfairness. And when enough people stand together, even the strongest grip of control eventually breaks. And maybe that's the takeaway we should all carry. Not just for HOAs, but for life itself.